right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the International Spy Museum on this rainy night. It seems like the last few times I've done introductions, it's been just like this, so thanks for coming out. Again, good evening. Thank you for coming to the International Spy Museum this evening. I'm Chris Costa, the Executive Director of the museum, and I'm excited to introduce this program with award-winning author Neal Bascomb. This is the fourth time that Neal has spoken here. He has written notable books, including The Winter Fortress, about the World War II Norwegian sabotage mission, and I'll go off script in a minute to talk about that, and also Hunting Eichmann, about the mission to bring the notorious Nazi to justice. We've had him speak here about both of those previous works, and this is the first time I've had an opportunity to meet Neal, and I just told him, just this week, in fact, I sat with the Norwegians, the Norwegian military attaché, and we talked about the operation known as Telemark, which was that Norwegian sabotage mission. So that's one of my favorite stories, and I'm really anxious to dig into that book. And Hunting Eichmann, ironically, I just spent some time with the former Mossad officer who wrote a book or has done extensive research on Eichmann. So I'm really excited about those works. Moreover, Lucy, part of our staff here, Lucy Stern, said that she loves to sell Neal Bascomb books because they're her favorites. So that's powerful affirmation. As I noted, Neal is a national award-winning and New York Times best-selling author of a number of books, all nonfiction narratives, all focused on inspiring stories like this story of adventure or achievement. His work has been translated into over 15 languages, featured in several documentaries, and optioned for major film and television projects. He was born in Colorado and raised in St. Louis. He is the product of public schools, and he spent lots of time playing hockey. He earned a double degree in economics and English literature at Miami University. He lived in Europe for several years as a journalist and worked as an editor at St. Martin's Press in New York. In 2000, he started writing books full-time. He is an avid hiker, skier, and coffee drinker. Neal is happily settled in Seattle, Washington with his family. Of course he drinks coffee, right? He's from Seattle. We're excited to have Neal today to discuss his new book, The Escape Artists, A Band of Daredevil Pilots, and the Greatest Prison Break of the Great War, which will be available for purchase and signing afterwards. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Neal. Thanks, Neal.
This is an enormous bottle of water. I think I'm all set. Well, good evening. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Spy Museum, Amanda, the hosts, for having me here again. I kind of love this room, but I'm excited to see the new museum next year. So I'm always, a little bit, when I start these book tours, a little bit tense about giving these speeches. But I just spoke about 3 days ago to about 500 eighth graders. So I think I'll be okay with this crew here tonight. Now, I've written about all kinds of different subjects, some spy-related, some architecture, running, and people ask me where I often get my ideas from or why I choose certain subjects. And I basically ask myself two questions. One, is there something new that I can offer in a story? And for this particular story, there hasn't been a great deal written, so that one was very easy to answer for me. The second question that I ask is, does this story have something important to say? And I'll be honest that I began this story and began researching it, and in some sense began writing it before I even had an answer to that question, mainly because I just love escape stories. Escape from Alcatraz, anybody? Clint Eastwood? Yes? One of my favorite films of all time. I always wanted to write an escape story, so I sort of leapt into this. But it wasn't until a Labor Day ago when I was going down to San Francisco with my family, and I have two daughters. They were 10 and 12, and I asked them, what do you want to do? Do you want to go to the ferry building, eat some nice food? Do you want to ride a cable car? Do you want to bicycle over the Golden Gate Bridge? And my 10-year-old says, I want to go to the Rock. I want to go to Alcatraz. And so I said, of course, let's do it. I thought maybe they were a little young for that, but no. Off we go on the ferry and go across, and my 12-year-old at the time said, "It looks so impossible. How could they have escaped from that?" And we went and we toured, and it's a pretty remarkable tour, very well done. And on the way back, my 10-year-old says to me, "It just seems so impossible. How could they have done that?" And they said, and I said, "Well, what do you think about that?" And she said, "They must have really wanted to be free." Now, I'm not trying to equate murderers and robbers to the POWs that I'm going to talk tonight, but I think that essential feeling, that essential drive for freedom, for the ability to exercise one's will, take one's own schedule in hand, is at the heart of what the story of Escape Artists covers. Now, I'll introduce first this individual, James Bennett. James Bennett, starting in about 1939, 1940, every week he would go into his daughter's bedroom while she was still sleeping. He would open a locked cupboard, take out of the cupboard some slides, some photos, some various other paraphernalia. He would then leave his house, walk to the train station, go into the heart of London, and then switch to a car, and then that car would take him out to air stations across England. Now, James was, at that time, an agent for MI9, which is the British Escape and Evasion Service. And these are, in fact, his lecture notes that he would give to pilots on a weekly basis, teaching them the art of escape. And if any of you find yourselves captured later tonight, by any chance, DC can be a treacherous town. The most important one that James would highlight is the bottom one: escape as soon as possible, get out as soon as possible. Now, however James talked about what to do in the terms of escape, he would always start with the story of this individual, David Gray. David Gray was actually born in India. His father was a gambler. His father was a bit of a drunk. And David Gray wanted to be everything that his father was not. He went to military school, then studied to be an Army engineer. He served with the British India Army. When World War I broke out, he served on that front. And then in about 1915, he saw some planes flying overhead and decided that that's what he wanted to do. He didn't want to build any more bridges. He didn't want to dig any more trenches. He wanted to, I know, right? By the end, it'll be over. This is the travails of being on book tour, a sore throat. So David wanted to join the RFC, the Royal Flying Corps. And at World War I, you have to understand, again, or you probably most know, that this is not long after Kitty Hawk. This is one of the first air forces. The generals at the time in London thought that the RFC planes in general would be, as they called it, a useless and expensive fad. When asked how many planes they needed, they said 2. 2 for the entire war. But what they discovered soon after the first battles broke out over the Western Front was that planes were very useful in reconnaissance, then in attacking behind enemy lines, and then, of course, of repelling the German Air Force. And the question was, who was going to fly these planes? Who was going to get up in the air in what were essentially wood, cloth, and piano wire wrapped together? These planes were very dangerous. The engines weren't terribly trustworthy. In training alone, 1/4 of pilots died. That was, as the air marshal would say, the wastage rate for pilots before they even got to the front. And the questions they asked these pilots were rather odd. They asked initially, do you ride horses when interviewing potential air pilots, which seemed an odd question. They also asked whether or not they preferred Shelley or Tennyson, which again, I'm not sure how that plays into it, but they wanted a certain type of individual. For the most part, those individuals were Oxbridge, educated, rich, wealthy daredevils. David Gray was very different than that, of course. He was one of the few pilots with any experience, and he quickly became quite a good fighter pilot. And in the war, when he found himself over the Western Front, if 1/4 of pilots died just in training, the average lifespan for pilots at the time was 17 hours in the air. 17 hours, and you would be almost guaranteed to either be shot down or killed. The pilots were not issued parachutes. Although the technology existed, they were not issued parachutes, largely because their superior officers thought that it would cut down on their aggressiveness in the air, that they wouldn't go down fighting, which seems a rather cool decision. September 1916, David Gray is shot down by none other than Oswald Boelke, who was the lead German ace in the same dogfight. In his first dogfight ever was the Red Baron. The Red Baron von Richthofen shot down David Gray's second in command of his squadron. Two other individuals I'd like to introduce just briefly. The first is Cecil Blaine. Cecil Blaine was sort of your classic RFC pilot at the time, fairly wealthy, very well educated, had been in South Africa, and then came back and volunteered to be part of the war effort. The second is Caspar Kennard. Caspar was, well, I'm not sure he was a great pilot. He was shot down or came down on his first mission on the Western Front. So what happens when you're on the Western Front and you're shot down and captured behind enemy lines? You are, in essence, one of 1.6 million prisoners that the Germans held just in 1916 alone. A massive sea of people. Some camps had between 30 and 40,000 prisoners. Officers like Captain Gray and Second Lieutenant Blaine and Kennard were put in camps devoted to officers themselves. They were treated much better than the enlisted ranks, who were largely sent to work camps, sometimes in coal mines, salt mines, and in many cases worked to death. The officers had a better experience, but it wasn't, as some thought that it would be, this halcyon time for prisoners of war, as they called it, because of the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. They didn't have it quite as bad as prisoners of old. Back in the Byzantine era, I tell a rather grim story. The 8th graders love this story, I'm not sure why, but a Byzantine emperor captured 14,000 prisoners. He blinded a lot of them and then sent them marching in columns back home, led by one out of every 100 who he only took a single eye from. This individual here is General von Hainisch. He was a failed general. His lines were overrun on the front twice. His son was killed. He was demoted and then removed from action. He was put in charge of running the 10th German Army District, put in charge of running prisoner of war camps. He was determined to make life as miserable as possible for the men under his watch. So Gray, Blaine, Kennard, they're sent to these camps, and what do from the very start? They try to get out. They try just about everything. Gray, who spoke German fluently, disguised himself as in a German uniform, forged a pass, walked straight through the front gate of the prison, said Guten Morgen to the guards, and took straight out. He got all the way to the border, and in an unfortunate circumstance, there were two towns, one in Holland and one in Germany. They had the same name. Gray walked into a police station in the town he thought was in Holland, discovers that he had taken a wrong turn and actually was still in German territory. He walked straight into the police station where the Germans recaptured him, sent him, can you imagine how heartbreaking that would be, and was, not to laugh at his expense, was sent back to a camp at Schwarmstedt, which was basically a swamp. He was put in a chamber for almost 2 months with very little water, very little food, and almost went mad. Blaine and Kennard also made numerous escape attempts, and they were one of many trying to get out of these camps any way possible. And it was almost, you can see these cartoons here, rather odd attempt of dressing up as a horse. But there were many clever ways they attempted these things. Two of my favorite are two men had the guards occupied by some of their mates. They dug a trench in the yard. They covered themselves in the dirt. They had reeds to breathe through. They waited until night. They dug themselves out and leapt over the fence to freedom. The Russians, I love the Russians for their inventiveness. The Russians decided that they were going to build a hot air balloon in the top of their barracks that they were being held. They made it out of paper mache. Surprisingly, the guards found it and burned it. They kept trying to get out. And the question I had, and the question I always wanted to answer in this book, was why? What was it about being a prisoner that was so harsh, so difficult for these individuals that they needed to get out? And one of my sort of windows into that, besides my 10-year-old daughter, not relying on her alone, was this individual named Will Harvey. Will Harvey was a scout on the Somme battlefront. He was very brave. He would often go out on his own. One afternoon in 1916, he went in the mid-afternoon into the German forward trenches to map them out. They were large. They were deserted at the time. He spent about an hour in there mapping them out when he suddenly found himself confronted by two German guards, was captured, and sent to prison camp. He was also a poet, a very good poet, and wrote brilliantly of what it was like to be in the trenches, but he also wrote brilliantly about what it was to be a POW. He described it as a kind of moldiness that would grow on the brain, that inability to do as one pleased, the inability to act in a way that one wanted. And I know you guys came for the poetry tonight. This looks like a poetry crowd. Yes? Yes? Okay, a little poetry from Will Harvey describing what it was to be a prisoner of war. This he wrote, one of his earliest poems, and fortunately tonight I have Claire Barrett here, who was living in London at the time, was an awesome researcher for me, and I'm so glad you're here. This is Will Harvey. Laugh, oh laugh loud, all yet who long ago adventure sought in gallant company. Safe in stagnation, laugh, laugh heartily, while on this filthiest backwater of time's flow, drift we and rot till something set us free. Laugh like old men with senses atrophied, heeding no present to the future dead, nodding quite foolish by the warm fireside, and seeing no flame but only I, the red, and flickering embers of pictures of the past, life like a cinder fading black at last. In 1917, the Germans decide that all these individuals like David Gray and Cecil Blaine and Kennard, scores of other pilots who are constantly trying to get out, who are constantly making the runs for the border and being recaptured, they needed to do something about it. They needed to stop them, so they decided to build what they thought was the kind of Alcatraz of Germany in a former cavalry barracks. And the prisoners had their own grapevine. And they thought that, this is a sort of direct quote from one of them, they thought that Holzminden, which is where this camp was located, would be a prisoner's mecca with fine brand new buildings, spacious grounds, good scenery, and good air. That was not the case. Holzminden was in essence a prison inside a prison inside a prison. They first had the exterior walls, high walls, and then they had a high barbed wire fence, a dead man zone, which you see in gray, and then another fence, all surrounding where the prisoners lived. They had round-the-clock guards, they had German shepherds patrolling, and they had additional sentries patrolling the exterior. Put in charge of the camp was an individual named Karl Niemeyer. Now, Karl was a kind of tyrant of the First Order. this is the description, I have to read some of these descriptions the British had of him because they're said in a way that only British can. This is the number of epithets that they had for Karl Niemeyer. He was a cad, a low-bred ruffian, the personification of hate, a bloated, pompous, crawling individual, a man of unbridled ferocity and bravado, a cheat, a plausible rogue, a coward with all the attributes of one. He deceives, he is cruel, he blusters, he is dishonest, he cringes. That was Karl Niemeyer. This cartoon, which is actually from Will Harvey's book, displays what all the officers, the British and Allied officers, knew, that even Karl Niemeyer's dog hated him, couldn't stand him. Karl was born in Germany. He spent 17 years in America. If you were to believe one of his innumerable stories, he was a bartender, a billiard maker, he was a spy. He came back to fight in the war. He was a decorated hero on the front. Karl was an inveterate liar, couldn't stop himself, but what he was most of all was a very stern disciplinarian. He would walk the yard with a pistol in hand. The men were not allowed to be near the windows. If he saw one near the windows, he would shoot at it. And when men entered the camp, he would point at their chest and declare, "None of you will ever escape." Now, when Gray and Blaine and Kennard and others arrived at Holzminden, they did what they'd done at every other camp. They tried to figure out how to get out as soon as possible. They tried a number of things. They tried to break through a wall. They tried at one point to sort of do a series of leapfrogs over the fences. That did not work. They ultimately decided to dig a tunnel. They thought that the tunnel would only need to be 15 yards. And the thing about building a tunnel is you need to find a point to start it. They reconnoitered the whole camp and then discovered that on this stairwell leading down to the cellars, there was a plank partition wall, arguably to keep from prisoners from hiding behind it and jumping the guards. Now, what Niemeyer and von Hainisch had done, in essence, of starting Holzminden, was they had put together all these individuals who had numerous escapes under their belt. These men knew how to make disguises, they knew how to forge passes, they knew how to make fake walls, they knew how to tunnel, they knew any number of techniques, and they created what in essence was an escape university at Holzminden. And so if you needed a carpenter to build you a fake door, or a door that was seamless and that you could press and it would open, and then you could close it behind you and no one would know that there was a pivot there, there was something to do that in 2 hours. And so that's how they began the tunnel at Holzminden. They initially thought that it would only need to be 15 yards long. They started it in November of 1917. They were almost done with it by Christmas time. They thought that they would be out by the new year, when suddenly Niemeyer began to post sentries right outside, in numerous places outside the walls, not only in them. And on one spot where they had hoped to come up, he had placed a sentry. So they suddenly understood that there was no way they were going to have a short tunnel. They were going to have to build a tunnel that would go 70 yards to these rye fields and bean fields where they would have cover to come out of the ground. The men, for the most part, wanted to quit. It was too long of a way to go. They were digging about a foot a day, and they just thought it would be too impossible. And David Gray, who was at this point what they called the father of the tunnel, the one in charge, determined to do it, and so he inspired the men to do so. Now, to dig this tunnel, it was nowhere near as clean and neat as this. But this diagram shows you the entry point and the sort of movement under the wall to give you an idea. But to dig a tunnel 70 yards long with spoons going a foot a day was not pleasant work. Caspar Kennard, who was an absolute claustrophobe, recalls going into the tunnel, and you had to go in head first and you had to come out feet first. There was no other way. You crawled on your belly. You couldn't raise yourself above your elbows. Dirt would constantly crawling at the back of your neck. Rats scurried over you, trying to find their own way out. It was miserable, dark, dank work. You had a single candle lighting the way. Cave-ins were frequent. And I love this cartoon, so I'll explain it a little bit. They needed a way to support the tunnel, so they began to take bedboards from all the beds throughout camp. It got to the point in about June of 1918, when they were almost done with the camp, that you could not sit on your bed at Holzminden without going through it. There was no support. So the men dig and dig and dig, and there are, of course, challenges in that. They run into a stone wall. They have to burn through some steel supports of the walls. But they began by sort of mid-July, they're ready to go. Now, throughout this process, David Gray made it very clear to everybody that it wasn't enough to get out of Holzminden. You needed to get out of Holzminden, and then you needed to make it 150 miles to the border of Holland, which was no easy task. You had to ford rivers, you had to go around bridges, you had to go around towns. There would be a massive manhunt for you. And so he knew that you had to be prepared for that run. And so the men, over the course of months, began getting supplies sent in to them. I know this crowd again, they like poetry and they look like they like ox tongue. This is them smuggling in wire cutters and button compasses in these parcels sent from home. Here is a shaving brush. Hidden inside of it was a train timetable and the town nearest the Dutch border where one individual would take a train. So on July 23rd, 24th, the men go through the tunnel. About 80 were ready to go, to get out, starting with Gray, Blaine, and Kennard. They began to come out of the hole. They dug it out, and 29 got out before the cave itself collapsed. Now, David Gray, who was determined more than anyone probably to get out and get to safety, to what he called his home run to England, came up with an ingenious ruse to make his way the 150 miles. He decided that and you can just, if you recall what the individuals looked like at the beginning of this story and what they looked like, this is their outfits that they were in when they made their run to the border. Look how gaunt and sallow their cheeks are. They were essentially on a starvation diet by the time they broke out. They were much weakened, and it was a very hard run. So they needed a way to get past villagers and policemen if they were caught. And so David Gray came up with this idea that he, who spoke German fluently, would act as an orderly from an insane asylum. And Blaine, who is on the far left here, would be his assistant. And Caspar Kennard would be an escaped lunatic. Yes, this is true. They had papers. These are Blaine's forged papers describing himself as a guard at this insane asylum called Vecta at about 50 miles from the Dutch border. They go on the night of the escape. They get out. They find themselves confronted in a village quite quickly. David Gray signals to Caspar Kennard. Caspar Kennard starts to go mad. He starts foaming at the mouth. He falls to the ground. He starts wriggling. Blaine, who has what is in essence just aspirin, delivers the aspirin into Kennard's mouth. He goes still. The villagers just want him to get the hell out of there, which is understandable. And they find themselves freely let go, and that is how they made their 150-mile run to the border. The tunnel was discovered about 8 hours after the men got out. Carl Niemeyer, a farmer, discovered a hole in his land, stormed up to the camp. Niemeyer was alerted. They found the hole. He sent one of his guards to go into the tunnel. The guard refused. Niemeyer's dog refused. What ended up happening was they dug up the tunnel from its exit point all the way until they found its entry point underneath the stairwell. That's the only way they found it. That hidden wall made it the whole way. And that is actually the dirt underneath the stairwell you see in the photo to the right. And that sort of dark spot is the opening of the tunnel itself when it was discovered. Now, probably one of my favorite stories in a book that has quite a few humorous moments is this individual named Lieutenant Colonel Charles Rathborn. Rathborn was the senior officer at the camp, and so he was allowed to be one of the earliest ones out. Rathborn had no intention of running 150 miles to the border. He decided that he would take a train. That was actually his shaving brush that was delivered to him. He spoke German also fluently. He had the tailor in this escape university design him a very nice business suit. He wore it underneath his regular uniform. So when he emerged from the tunnel, he basically took it off and looked like a German businessman on his way to the local train station. He made it. It took 15 days for Gray, Kennard, and Blaine to make it. It took Charles 36 hours. Charles did it the smart way, I think. Charles fortunately had the ability to send a telegram to Carl Niemeyer as soon as he made it to freedom. It's probably my favorite few words in this whole book. This is Lieutenant Colonel Rathborn to Niemeyer by telegram. Having a lovely time, stop. If I ever find you in London, stop. Will break your neck, stop. The news back in England was it was huge news, this escape, not only nationally, internationally. It was sort of the height of British daring do in one of the darkest times of the war. The British made a huge propaganda splash with it, and it was quite effective. And this is in the summer of 1918 when some of the fiercest fighting was going on. I just want to tether this back to James Bennett, who was also at Holzminden, was one of the 10 who made the home run to Holland. James was captured. He was an observer in the Royal Navy Air Service. His plane went down over the North Sea. He was captured by a submarine, of all things, found himself in numerous camps escaping at Holzminden, and then made his way out. His children didn't know anything of his time with MI9. Not until his death did they discover the various receipts and various lecture notes and the rest showing that he was a part of MI9. He was an absolute hero. His daughter had no idea of it, and she thought it was just tribute to the kind of man that he was, and knew that was that sort of courage, but also his modest nature was part of what made him such a great man. And so it's my honor to sort of talk about him tonight and feature him in this book, and thank you all for listening. And I'm happy to take questions if anyone has them on this dark and stormy night in Washington, D.C.
I want to know what happened to, I'm going to mess up his name, but the commander of Holland.
So of Carl Niemeyer, what happened to Carl Niemeyer? Niemeyer had stolen pretty much half of the money that was sent to these prisoners were allowed to draw on their bank accounts. He stole most of their money. He ran the canteen in a sort of at exorbitant prices. So he entered the war a rather rich man. He knew that he was targeted as a war criminal, namely for shooting 2 prisoners who had escaped previously. He got away. We don't know what happened to him. There's a rumor that he committed suicide in Stuttgart about a year after the war. There's no proof of that. What we do know is that Carl actually had a twin brother who was in charge of another camp. His nickname was Windy Dick. Carl's was Milwaukee Bill. And they both, I think, got away with the money. Anybody else? Good.
What are the parallels, if there are any, between this grand escape from World War I and the great escape from World War II? I'm assuming that was a true story as well, or is based on a...
Yes, so the great escape of Steve McQueen on the motorcycle fame, yes, we all know that. It is a true story, and I couldn't actually, in my research, I couldn't find any sort of definitive connection between the two in relation to the fact that MI9, which was created, and the lectures that were given were by many of these Holtzminden prisoners and other World War I escapees. They were the sort of foundation of MI9. They were lecturing to pilots and soldiers about escape and evasion. I would imagine that those lectures included tunneling and the like. So the parallels between them are just remarkable in terms of how they originated the tunnel, how it was supported, how they kept it hidden. All of it is the echoes are really there. So I would venture to say that some of the individuals at Styleglow 3 were lectured by MI9, which were lectured by the likes of James Bennett. Yes, sir.
Hold on.
Parallels to Colditz, it's parallels to Colditz prison in World War II. Was that supposed to be a pregnable German prison as well?
Yes, World War II had some remarkable states. Colditz is probably, I think, the most remarkable one of World War II. Again, I would imagine. I mean, these lectures by MI9 were pretty wide. James was one of about 15 lectures going around to bases constantly. So again, I think just they would have heard the lecture. They would have had MI9 also did supplies and smuggled in supplies to these individuals. They taught disguises. They taught how to make fake walls. They taught how to communicate with coded messages, all of which are aspects of what happened in World War II at Colditz and other places. But just to give you an idea of the impact, I think, of MI9, in World War I, 573 individuals like David Gray and Cecil Blaine who had been captured made it to Holland or other places back to England. In World War II, the numbers of British Commonwealth and Americans who found themselves captured or caught behind enemy lines and made it back, 33,500. So the difference and the impact of MI9 is pretty remarkable. And of course, the Americans also had their own escape and evasion service, the SEER training, which was implemented, a little bit later in the war.
Did they take it out on the prisoners who didn't escape, I wonder? It seems like something...
Yeah, Niemeyer, 29 got out, 10 made it, so 19, if I do my math, did not. Niemeyer was so incensed that he had one man literally tore his clothes off, tore his watch off, and smashed it with a hammer. Niemeyer did not have control of his temper very well. They were put in isolation for a number of months. Also, consequence of that, 2 other Holzminden escapees, men tried to get away, and as I referenced earlier, they were shot and killed in rather cold-blooded manner. I can hear you.
Oh, but I need it for the video.
I was just wondering what the daily life or the routine was at Holzminden. Like, how were they able to have the ability to get to that stairwell, go into the false wall, and dig so long? I assume there were a lot of people doing it, but just how were they able to be free to go there so much?
So, as I said in the very beginning, there were officer camps and then enlisted ranks camps. one of the sort of rules that came out of Hague is that you could not force officers to work at camps. So they were essentially idle. They had nothing to do. So they had roll call 2 or 3 times a day, depending. Otherwise, they spent their times in rather odd ways. In some, they had theater clubs, they had a library, they had an orchestra. They were allowed out on parole, which essentially meant that they could sign an agreement on a card that they would not escape, and they were allowed out of camp to take a stroll in the countryside, and then they would come back to camp, and then they would start digging again. Not a single individual broke parole. That was a sort of gentlemanly code that they had. So there were about 500 officers, and there were about 20 of them doing the digging here. They worked in 3-man shifts, and they just weren't missed because they were the other men were lingering in the barracks, or they were, singing arias, doing all kinds of various things. So, all right, well, thank you very much, everybody, for the questions. You got one more, Amanda?
No, but I'm going to say, well, I'll come up with something later, but Neal will be here to sign his book, which is for sale, and thank you very much.
Thank you.